Hello everyone and welcome to our presentation on the Quantitative Results chapter. Just before we get started with the presentation today, I'd like to present this information in case you're interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we do offer assistance with all aspects of the dissertation, so if you are interested in more one-on-one help, you can use the information you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we can provide. Just to give an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, so this presentation is on the components of the quantitative results chapter, so we'll only be covering aspects of quantitative results today. If you are interested in qualitative studies, we do have other webinars that cover qualitative research, so I would direct you to those webinars if your research is qualitative. But first, we're going to talk about the purpose of the results chapter and the importance of the results chapter to the dissertation. Then we're going to talk about the components of the results chapter, including introduction, information about data collection and preparation, the descriptive statistics, assumptions testing, the analyses of the research questions, and the summary. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions. So if you do have a question, during the presentation, you can enter that into the question section. Then at the end of the presentation, any questions that aren't answered during the course of the presentation, I'll do my best to answer those questions at the end. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the results chapter and why it's important to the dissertation. So the purpose of the results chapter is to present the data and the analyses that you conducted to answer your research questions and hypotheses. So the previous sections of the dissertation, so namely your introduction, literature review, and methodology chapters, are aimed at establishing why your research needs to be done and how you will do your research or how you did your research. Then once you get to the results chapter, you can finally present the findings of what you did after you conducted everything that you set out to do according to your methodology chapter. So here is where you present the findings based on your data collection and the answers to your research questions and hypotheses. So by the end of the results chapter, you should have a clear answer to each research question and hypothesis that you listed out earlier in your dissertation. So if you have 5 research questions, you should have an answer to each of those 5 research questions by the end of your results chapter. So you want to present the findings for each research question with a clear statement that answers that research question. But you want to save further interpretation for the discussion chapter. So you don't want to go much farther beyond the answer to the research question in the results chapter itself. Any discussion of what the results mean in terms of the literature, the theory, or any of those things, that discussion should be saved for your discussion chapter. And one important thing to note is that this presentation will be covering the sections that are most typical for quantitative results chapters based on our experience with many different schools, but your specific school or degree program may have different requirements. So you should always refer to your school's guidelines or your degree program's guidelines, if they have any for you, that specify what information and sections need to go into your results chapter. So now let's talk about the different components of the results chapter, starting with the introduction. So like most other chapters in the dissertation, you may want to start with an introduction where you reorient the reader to the purpose of the study and your research questions, and then give an outline of what the chapter will include. So you can start by just restating the purpose statement or the problem statement. And this can be either a verbatim restatement of your purpose or problem from your previous chapters, or it can be an abbreviated version of the problem or purpose statement. And you also want to restate your research questions and hypotheses. And these should be restated verbatim as they appear in the other parts of your dissertation. So wherever your research questions and hypotheses appear, they should appear with the exact same wording and in the exact same order every time they appear in the paper. And then you can outline the contents of the results chapter. And this can be done by simply listing out the different section headings that will appear in the chapter. And the first thing you want to talk about in terms of your results is the data collection and preparation. So in this section, you will want to summarize your data collection procedures and note any changes from the procedures that you originally proposed. So here's where you want to talk about what you actually did and carried out in your data collection, and if this was different from what you originally proposed to do in your methodology chapter. So it may be the case, for one reason or another, that when you actually carry out your data collection and do your study, you might have to do some things differently from what you propose in your methodology. So maybe the population that you plan to study wasn't available, so you had to make some changes to that. Or maybe an instrument that you plan to use, you weren't able to get, so you had to use a different instrument. Or whatever the case may be, if anything changed from what you originally proposed to do in your methodology chapter, from what you actually ended up doing in your results chapter, you will want to note those changes. And this can be done in a number of different ways. Some schools may want you to actually go back to the methodology chapter and make changes to the methodology chapter to reflect what you actually did. Other schools may want you to keep the methodology chapter exactly the same and then note the changes in the results chapter. So again, you'll want to refer to your school's specific guidance on how they want you to present that. But if there were any changes from what you proposed to what you carried out, you do want to discuss that in some way. In terms of your data collection, you will want to discuss response rate and attrition. So for instance, if you're doing just a simple survey study where you maybe sent out an online survey to people and gathered their responses, you'll want to talk about things like how many total responses did you receive? So how many people accessed the survey? And did you have to remove or exclude any of those responses? So it may be the case that, maybe you have to exclude some people because they didn't complete the whole survey, or maybe you had specific inclusion criteria and some of the respondents did not meet those criteria and you had to exclude them. So you'll want to discuss any responses that you have to remove for any of those reasons and state how many responses you had to remove. After all that is said and done, you want to state what your final total sample size was. So the sample size that will end up being used in the analysis. And then it may be the case that a post-hoc power analysis is necessary if you did not meet your target sample size. Again, this will depend on the requirements of your school. Some schools will require this, some schools won't, and some schools will require it only under certain conditions. But sometimes if you don't reach the target sample size that you set out in your methodology chapter, when your data collection is finished, then sometimes you'll need to conduct a post-hoc power analysis to calculate the power that you achieved with the sample size that you obtained. In this section, you'll also want to discuss any preliminary data preparation steps. So this can involve discussions of checking data for accuracy, which is important if you have to take paper and pencil survey responses and enter them manually into an electronic form. So you want to check those data entries for accuracy to make sure there's no errors in the data entry, as well as handling missing data. So it's very likely going to be the case, especially if you're doing something like survey research, where you're going to have missing data of some kind, whether it's participants just not finishing the survey, or maybe they skip some questions, whatever the case may be, it's very likely you'll have some missing responses and you'll need a plan to handle those. Usually that's laid out in your methodology chapter, but here you'll want to discuss the actual steps that you took to handle the missing data. So, are you just going to exclude all the participants who are missing any responses at all? Or are you going to try to keep participants who had some missing data, but then replace those missing values in some way? So maybe using some kind of an imputation or a mean replacement or some other method. Here, you may also want to discuss any steps you need to take to code or recode the data or compute scores for your variables of interest. So if you're using a survey instrument to measure some variable, maybe it's a survey instrument that has 10 questions and it measures some construct like self-efficacy or leadership style. So do any of those 10 questions need to be coded or recoded? So is any reverse coding necessary? Do you need to compute a score from those 10 variables? So compute an overall score for self-efficacy by perhaps adding the responses of the items together or averaging the responses together to get a total score. You'll want to describe that process in detail for each variable or any other recoding of variables that you need to do. And so here are just a few examples of excerpts of what a write-up for the data collection and preparation portion of the results may look like. So in this example here, we see that we start by saying how many initial survey responses were collected. And then we talk about participants who were missing data and say how we removed them and state what our final total sample size was. And then we also state how we dealt with any other remaining missing data. In this case, saying that we used an imputation to replace those values. Here's another example of how this might look. So this contains a little bit more detail. So we start by saying when the data collection took place, and again, stating how many total participants responded to the survey. And then we go into detail about any participants that we excluded for various reasons. So maybe they didn't agree to the informed consent, or they were missing a certain percentage of respondents, or they didn't meet the inclusion criteria. And then we state at the end what our final total sample size was after applying all of those exclusions. And then here's just an example of how you might write up the results of a post-hoc power analysis if you're required to do one. So we state that we're doing a post-hoc power analysis. We state what analyses we're doing it for. In this case, we're doing one for an independent samples t-test and for a regression. And so you'll want to state the sample size that was used in the analysis and then the level of power achieved for each test. So after you go through all of the data collection and preparation steps, you will want to start with some basic descriptive statistics for your data. So you want to present descriptive statistics for any demographic information you collect, as well as all of your variables of interest. Your variables of interest would just be the variables that are listed in your research questions and hypotheses. So examples of descriptive statistics that you might compute would be frequencies and percentages for categorical variables. So examples of those would be things like gender or ethnicity. And then for continuous variables, you might compute means and standard deviations. So examples of continuous variables would be something like someone's age in years or grade point average. If possible, you may want to compare the demographic characteristics of your sample to the population to give the reader an idea of the representativeness of your sample. So if you have information, for instance, about the breakdown of gender, so the percentage of males and females there are in the population that you're studying, and you also collected information on gender, you may want to present a short statement comparing the breakdown of gender in your sample to the gender breakdown in the population to see if it's similar or different. And if you have any measures for which you can compute reliability coefficients, so this would usually be something like Cronbach's alpha, then you'll want to compute and present those reliability coefficients. So this would be for survey instruments that have multiple items. So again, going back to our example of maybe a 10-item measure of self-efficacy, since you're computing an overall self-efficacy score from those 10 items, you probably want to run a reliability analysis on the 10 items to make sure that the instrument is reliable. And so here are some examples of how you might write up the descriptive statistics. So here we just have a little bit of narrative and a table to describe some categorical variables. So we see here in our table, we have frequencies and percentages for these categorical variables, as well as some narrative to describe the table. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that anytime a table appears in your results chapter, or really anywhere in your dissertation for that matter, you want to make sure that that table is referenced in the narrative text. So we see here in the narrative, we say we make specific reference to table 1. And we also want to make sure that that table appears in close proximity to where it is first referenced in the text. So you don't want to mention table 1 in the text and then table 1 doesn't appear until 5 or 10 pages later. Table 1 should appear basically immediately following when you mention it in the text. Here's another table example of how you might present some descriptive statistics for continuous variables. So here in this table, we present the minimum and maximum values as well as the mean and the standard deviation. And then here's an example of how you might present reliability coefficients or Cronbach's alphas. So in this table, we have a number of different scales and subscales that we have computed reliability coefficients for. So we present the number of items in the scale as well as the computed reliability coefficient or Cronbach's alpha. So after you've gone through and presented all of your descriptive statistics, it's time to start getting into the actual testing for your research questions and hypotheses. But before you can get into the results of each of those tests, you have to talk about assumptions testing. Because virtually any statistical test that you do, or any inferential test that you do, will have some statistical assumptions associated with it. So for instance, if you're doing a comparison using something like a t-test or an analysis of variance or an ANOVA, then you may need to test the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance, for instance. And so you'll want a section to describe the assumptions that you tested, as well as the results of that assumptions testing. And one thing to note is that the assumptions can be presented in their own dedicated section, usually preceding discussion of your analyses, or they can just be presented alongside each analysis. And for the assumptions testing, you will want to discuss for each analysis that you're doing, the assumptions that are required for that analysis. So for instance, a t-test may require normality and homogeneity of variance. You'll want to state how each assumption is tested. So for that t-test, you want to say how you tested normality and how you tested homogeneity of variance. So for example, for testing normality, maybe you tested normality using a Shapiro-Wilk test, or maybe you tested it by looking at a histogram, or maybe you tested it by looking at skewness and kurtosis values, or maybe you used a combination of those methods. Whatever method or methods that you choose, you want to say how you're testing the assumption. You'll want to say what the result of the assumptions test was, and make a clear statement about whether the assumption was met or not. So, after you've done your test for normality, for instance, based on the method that you chose, what were the results of that test? So what did the histogram look like? What were the skewness and kurtosis values? What was the result of the Shapiro-Wilk test? And based on those results, was the assumption of normality met or was it not met? And if the assumption is not met, you want to describe any action that you take if the assumption isn't met. So for instance, if the assumption of normality is violated, you'll want to say what you did in response to the violation of that assumption. So did you try to transform the variable to make it normally distributed? Or maybe you decided to conduct an alternative test like a non-parametric test that doesn't require the normality assumption. So you just want to make sure that for each assumptions test, you state how you tested it, what the result of the assumption test was, and if the assumption was violated, what you did to account for the violation of that assumption. So now let's look at some examples of how you might present the results of assumptions testing. In this first example, we test for normality by looking at a PP plot. And so we see here in the narrative, we state how we're testing normality. And then we make an interpretation of this plot, saying that the data did not significantly deviate from the normal line. And we state that the assumption is met. Here's an example that discusses some more assumptions testing. In this case, we have an example where one of the assumptions is not met. So here we state that we checked the data for outliers, but then we state that there was an observation that we saw that was an outlier based on our test. And then we stated what we did with that outlier. So we're stating that this observation was excluded from the analysis. So we excluded that outlier from our analysis. After you talk about your assumptions, you can finally get into the answers or the analyses that answer your research questions and hypotheses. So you want to present the results of each analysis that you conducted to address each research question. And you should do this in the order that your research questions and hypotheses appear in the rest of your document. So if you have 5 research questions, you just want to go in order of research questions 1 through 5. You don't really want to change the order or jump around. Start with research question 2 and then jump to research question 5 and then go back to research question 1. You should present the analysis in a logical order. And much like your data collection procedures, if there were any changes in your results from what you originally proposed in your methodology in terms of your data analysis plan, then you will want to note and justify those changes. So, if there were changes in your data collection procedures, that may also result in changes in the analysis that you're able to do. So maybe you didn't get enough participants to do a particular analysis, or maybe the variables that you, or the data for the variables that you collected were a different level of measurement than what you originally anticipated. So that might change the type of analysis that you're able to do. So if you have to do a different analysis from what you previously proposed, you will want to state that, note that you had to do a different analysis and justify the new analysis. So state the reason why you changed the analysis and why the new analysis that you're doing is appropriate for the data that you collected. And for each analysis, you want to clearly identify the variables used. So if you are doing something like a t-test or an ANOVA, you want to identify your independent and dependent variables. If you're doing a correlational analysis like a regression, you want to identify your predictors and your criterion variable, as well as any covariates. You'll want to report the appropriate statistics associated with each analysis. So things like p-values, effect sizes, confidence intervals. So for a t-test, for instance, you might report the t-statistic, the p-value associated with that test, as well as a measure of effect size like Cohen's d. And then if your analysis requires any post-hoc testing, so for instance, if you're doing an ANOVA and the ANOVA was significant, you may need to do post-hoc tests to see exactly which groups were different from each other. So if that's applicable to your analysis, you want to present the results of that post-hoc testing. And very importantly, you'll want to include a clear statement that answers each research question and hypothesis based on the results of the analysis. So for each analysis, you want to make sure you have a very clear statement, for instance, if your hypothesis was supported or not, or a clear statement that answers the research question. If your hypotheses are written in the null and alternative format, the most common way to do this is to state that the null hypothesis was rejected if you had significant results, or the null hypothesis was not rejected if you had non-significant results. Now let's take a look at some examples of how you might write up the results for a couple of different analyses. So let's start with an independent samples t-test. So here, we first start by stating what analysis we're doing. And we also state our independent and dependent variables. We present the results of our t-test. In this case, it's not significant. We know that based on our p-value here, which is greater than 0.05. Here we also present our t-statistic with the degrees of freedom here in parentheses, as well as our measure of effect size for Cohen's d. And then we have a very clear statement in terms of our hypothesis. We say that the null hypothesis was not rejected. And then you may also want to present a table if applicable for the results. So for something like a t-test, you may want to present the means and standard deviations for the groups that you're comparing. Here's another example of a t-test. This time the t-test is significant. So again, we start by saying we're doing a t-test. We identify our independent and dependent variables. This time our t-test is significant because our p-value here is less than 0.05. And we make a very clear statement about our hypothesis, stating the null hypothesis was rejected. And again, we have a table showing the means of the groups that we are comparing. Here's an example of how you might write up the results of an analysis of variance or an ANOVA. Again, we start by saying that we're conducting an analysis of variance. We identify our independent and dependent variables. We present the results of our ANOVA. In this case, we present our F statistic. And in parentheses, we have two values for degrees of freedom. So anytime you do an F test, you will always have two values for degrees of freedom. The first value being the numerator degrees of freedom, and the second value being the denominator or error degrees of freedom. And we also present our associated p-value. In this case, the p-value is greater than 0.05, which would indicate that this test is not significant. So therefore, we do not reject the null hypothesis. We have a statement there saying the null hypothesis was not rejected. And again, we might have a table presenting the means of the groups that we're comparing with that ANOVA. Now we can look at some examples of correlational analyses. So here we have an example of results where we conducted Pearson correlations. And here we start by, we actually restate our research question here. We say that we're conducting Pearson correlations to look at the relationships between the variables. Then here we present, or we list out our variables, and we present our correlation coefficients and corresponding p-values. We do have significant correlations that are significant at the 0.05 level. And so we make a clear statement here that our null hypothesis was rejected. And if you have a lot of correlations, you may want to report the results of those correlations in a table like the excerpt of this table that we see here. Now here are the results of a regression analysis. So for a regression, you may want to start with the results of the overall regression model. So in this case, this would be an F test. So again, we present our F statistic in degrees of freedom, as well as the p-value for that test and our R-squared value, or the percentage of variance explained. And in this case, our regression is significant, and we make a statement where we reject the null hypothesis because that regression is significant. And for regression, you usually want to present a table with all of your predictors to show which predictors in your regression model were significant. So here in this table, we have a list of all of our predictor variables, along with the regression coefficients, the unstandardized coefficient, standard error, the beta or standardized coefficient, the corresponding t and significance values. And we see here, for instance, that the significant predictor in our regression model here is sex. Sex is a significant predictor at the 0.05 level. And here in our narrative, we just note that this was a significant predictor and make an interpretation of that regression coefficient. Once you have presented the results for all of your research questions, you usually end the results chapter with a summary section. This can either summarize the entire contents of the chapter, or it may just summarize the findings for the research questions. So here you'll want to restate the answer to each research question or hypothesis. So, if you have your hypotheses in null and alternative format, make a statement about each of your null hypotheses, whether it was rejected or whether you failed to reject that hypothesis. And then you can provide just a transitioning statement to your discussion chapter. So that brings us to the end of the presentation on the quantitative results chapter. Again, if you're interested in more support outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we provide. And so now I'll get into the question portion. So if you do have questions, you can put those into the question section, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So I will just go through and see what questions we have submitted so far. So one question is, if you're interviewing patients in a doctor's office and they stop midway to go to the appointment and come back after to complete the survey, can these surveys be counted as completed, or do you need to detail this in data collection section in results? So again, this will depend kind of on the nature of the information that you are collecting and the questions that they're answering. But if they skip any questions or they have incomplete data, like they had to go into their appointment before answering all the questions, maybe they come back and answer all the questions, maybe they don't. You'll need to have a plan for how you deal with any surveys that aren't fully completed. So you'll need a plan for how you want to deal with missing responses. So for instance, if you're just going to exclude any participants who didn't complete the whole survey, or try to include people but deal with their missing values in some way. And it looks like we have a couple of questions about like power analysis, post-hoc power analysis, and sample size. I won't go into a lot of detail about sample size calculation in this presentation because we do have other webinars that are specifically focused on power analysis and sample size calculation. So if you have specific questions about those topics, I would refer you to those webinars. But essentially, how you would initially calculate your sample size, and if you want to do a post-hoc power analysis, you can use a program like GPower to do that analysis. So in GPower, you would pick the specific statistical analysis that you plan to conduct or that you did conduct. You input parameters about that analysis. If you're doing a post-hoc power analysis, you would input the sample size that you obtained, and it would give you the level of power that you achieved with that sample size. Or if you're doing a sample size calculation based on the parameters that you input, it would tell you what sample size you need for that analysis. But again, we have webinars that are specifically dedicated to the discussion of power analysis and sample size calculations. So if you're more interested in that topic, you can check out those webinars to get more information about that. And a question is, when I'm calculating z-scores for a sample, do I use the mean, the standard deviation from the sample or the population? So if you're calculating z-scores for a particular variable in your sample, you would do it based on the sample mean and standard deviation typically. Another question is, if I'm running a regression using 6 values as predictor, but these 6 values group into 2 overall domains, do I run the regression on the 6 values or on the 2 domains? So it really depends on your specific research questions and hypotheses. So if you have specific hypotheses about the 6 values, then you would run it as the 6 values. If you have hypotheses about the 2 larger domains, then you would probably want to run it that way instead. So it really depends on what specifically your research questions and hypotheses are about. And the question is, running a multiple regression with 7 predictors, should I eliminate the insignificant predictor and run the test again? Not necessarily. Again, it depends on your specific research aims and research questions and hypotheses. Some people will, if they're trying to do model building, try to eliminate insignificant predictors from their regression model. But if you have specific research questions about a variable, whether that variable turns out to be significant or not, it should probably remain in your regression model if you have a specific research question or hypothesis about it. And another question is, if I have two groups, do I calculate z-scores separately for them? It really depends on exactly why you are computing the z-scores in the first place, what you're doing with those. Depending on what you're trying to do, it may or may not be appropriate for you to, or may not be necessary for you to calculate z-scores separately for the groups. What tests should I conduct to report the psychometrics of an instrument? So usually if you are trying to validate an instrument, you may start with something like an exploratory factor analysis. You may follow that up with a confirmatory factor analysis, which would usually be done on a completely separate set of data from your exploratory factor analysis, because the point of the confirmatory factor analysis is to see if the structure that comes out of the exploratory factor analysis can be applied to a different sample. And then, so those would be things that you would run for validity, and then for reliability, you would want to run something like a Cronbach's alpha. But again, it also depends on the nature of your instrument and the questions that are being asked. So what I just said here, so exploratory confirmatory factor analysis in Cronbach's alpha would apply to most survey questions or survey instruments that use, Likert type responses, for instance. Another question is, when I run a repeated measures ANOVA for two groups, do I run them together with a filter for each IV or separately? So again, it really depends on the nature of what you are trying to answer. It may even be possible for you to run this, instead of just as a repeated measures ANOVA on the group separately, you can include the grouping variable as a between subjects independent variable in the analysis. And that way you could actually see if there's statistical interaction between your grouping variable and the repeated measures effect that you're looking at. Another question is, do you always have to do a correlation matrix before the regression? Not necessarily, but it is common to present a correlation matrix if you have a lot of continuous variables that you have computed, for instance. So if you have a lot of different variables that you're using in your study, so maybe you have like self-efficacy and leadership and many other variables, then it is common to, before you present the analysis of your research questions, to just do a general correlation matrix between the variables. So that often goes in the descriptive section. It's not always required, but people will commonly include that as part of their descriptives. And let's just see if we have any other questions here. So there's a question about if your survey was about no sexual assault training was provided on campus, and then during the survey training was provided to the students, where do you address the findings of those who responded before and after the training? So in terms of where you would address the findings, so any findings you would address in your results chapter. And this would depend on if you had specific research questions about this. You know, if you're looking at responses to a survey, you know, before and after some kind of training happened, if you're surveying the same students before and after, you might do something like a paired samples t-test um, or repeated measures ANOVA. If they're different students that you surveyed before and after, then it would have to be an independent samples test. All right, it looks like those are all of the questions submitted so far that I'm able to answer. If anyone else has any other questions, you can go ahead and enter those into the question section now, and I'll give another minute or so for any additional questions to come in. All right, doesn't look like any other questions are coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation there for today. Thanks everyone for attending our webinar today. And again, if you are interested in additional help, if you want more one-on-one help, you can use the information on the screen now to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance we can give. If you're interested in additional topics, you can check out our other webinars to see what other topics we provide webinars for. But otherwise, again, thanks everyone for attending today. I hope you found this presentation useful, and I hope you have a great day.